Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. There's a lot of things to be learned from history. When we consider the history of Puerto Rico itself, there's a lot of things to be learned. And one of the things that I think that is to consider when we study history is the types of lessons that we take from history itself for the here and now. The history of Puerto Rico is very interesting. The history of Puerto Rico is very interesting because Puerto Rico is one of those places that was colonized after the fall of Al-Andalus, like right away. Like when Al-Andalus fell and you began to see the Spanish Catholics gain momentum, and you began to see movements like the Inquisition and so on and so forth. Latin America, the Caribbean, these were the first places, especially the Caribbean, places like Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico. These are the first places to be hit by the Spaniards after they came out of Al-Andalus, after they had reconquered Al-Andalus. So the whole, or what they called the reconquering. So one of the things that happened initially when they came is that they looked at, Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When they went into Puerto Rico, they looked at what was their food supply. So one of the things that was done was that wild pigs were thrown onto the shores of Puerto Rico and let loose so that there can be a food supply. The conquistadores, or those who were involved in the conquering process, it took a few years, little less than a decade. But when they came afterwards, they had their initial encounter and so on and so forth that took place. But when they came after, they had a plan. And the plan that they had was a plan to build and to have a system on multiple levels. And when I reflected upon this history, I began to ask myself, like, questions that pertain to the development of those communities that initially were started there. And so when you get into architecture and you get into art and you get into construction and you get into economy and you get into, city planning and organization, you have people that they had this vision that they were going to come into this new land and they were going to establish themselves, and it didn't happen haphazardly. And if you look at the US, it was the same thing. People came with these ideas, even after different stages of colonialism, people different groups that came, they eventually came and they had these strategies and these plans of how they were going to build themselves. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is taking lessons from history. One of the things, for instance, that we find is that the Muslim community has no real plan of how it's going to develop itself or how it's going to interact with the world. And here and there you have people that talk about, they have these grand ideas about, imperialism, or, they have ideas that, it's just like you ask, what time period are you living in? What society are you living in? Like, where's your head at in reality with regard to building community? And so one of the things that is a lesson is that in the past, one of the things that we saw was that there was like a charter of building, right? Like there was like a charter of building. And so, like, for instance, I'll give you an example. Like in Puerto Rico, for the most part, a church was built and it had a courtyard, a public courtyard. And in that public courtyard is a place where people met, and, and then the town was built on that type of concept. And so it caused me to think that, how are our masajid built? Off of what concept? Off of what philosophy? of a what engineering concept, because this stuff is like all over the place in the Muslim community, at this point in time. And so building has no real vision to it. It becomes like a building just for the sake of building and spending money, and then sometimes there's purpose to it, sometimes there's not. But imagine if the Muslim community from here on in, if it had a plan for how communities should be, and that plan was it was kind of a general plan that could be exported to communities all around, of how what things need to be in place in order to build community. And I'm not just talking about a physical location. I'm also talking about, what it is that community does. Imagine if we had 100 masajid that were built throughout the country, and they had an engineering plan, they had a community plan, they had an economic plan. Imagine what that would look like. Imagine what it would look like if those 100 masajid, with the engineering plan, the economic plan, or sustainability plan, the community plan, our architectural plan, what would that look like if they had 100 imams and 100 counselors, right? And 100 community developers, right? And if we built the community on that model, if we, in other words, I'm trying to give you a vision of, what leadership looks like. I'm not making this type of stuff up. You have organizations like the Catholic Church, like that's how they function. Is a tightly run ship. You have Al-Azhar al-Sharif in their preparation of leadership. That's partly how they function. They go into communities with a dawah plan. They go into communities with a dawah plan. If you look at how missionary activity operates, that's how it operated. There was a plan. You know what I'm saying? There was a plan on how that unfolds, and there were people that were supported, and there was something that was called sustainability. If you look at the tax, right? If you look at the tax forms for many nonprofits that do missionary activity, is in the millions people. And I've mentioned this before a couple years back. I'll mention it again. But that's what leadership looks like. That people have a certain degree of autonomy, that they, have a degree of funding, that they have a degree of knowledge and education, that they have a degree, of a team that they can operate from. And that plan is not just a plan that is operating in siloed and isolation, is operating in cooperation and collaboration, right? And so that's how you begin to develop communities, right? Imagine if, like, for instance, like when I think about 105th Street in Cleveland, Ohio, on the east side. 105th Street, for anybody that knows the east side, knows that was one of the most dangerous places. Not the dangerous place, but one of the most dangerous places on the east side of Cleveland. We say the Huff area has historically been known. And these are places, both of them, the Huff area, 105th Street, they're close proximity to each other. They've been known to be problematic areas. And then, we have the Harvard area, which is probably the premier area of problems, within that city. And the city itself has been engulfed in all of those problems. But I'm saying that to say that on the 105th Street, it's a problem area. The number of churches that are there are numerous. Churches that have property, they have parking lots, they have like multi-square foot, properties. Like you're talking about maybe sometimes in 3,000 square feet. You have one that has a pool. This is a place, the 105th Street that I'm talking about is a place that, Corey Methodist Church is a church that, Malcolm X went to speak at. And it's one of the most problematic areas. And so an elder was bringing up the point that look at 105th Street, how many churches it has. It's like versus having one church that's really well built, well established, and everything else is the economic engine for the community. They decided to overload the community with tens of churches, right? And nothing is effective and done. And that's the same thing that I say with the masajid. We're beginning to just reproduce mosques all over the place. But what is the effectiveness of these religious organizations? What about if we had community centers with mosques in them, right? And they had an educational component, and they had a community component. And what about if we exported these with one plan throughout the whole of the country? And imagine if we had a goal of making 50 of these community centers, well funded, well run, you know what I'm saying, well established with the vision, and with the manpower or the human power that's necessary in order to make those work. What do you think that would look like? What do you think it would look like if we had, 50 community centers, 100 masjids, and another 100, social service centers throughout the country on the same platform, and those groups interact with each other? What do you think if we had, we added on to that 100 schools, K through 12 schools, or just, high schools, 15 top-notch high schools, and we put them throughout the whole of the country? What would it look like if we had, about 3 private training institutions that dealt with high tech and trades that bring in money? What do you think that would? Now we're talking about bringing some solutions to situations, right? What do you think if we had, if we prepared 20 people to be community organizers, 100 people to be community organizers, and to be effective community organizers? What do you think about if we train people to go into, be mayors of a city or to work in local politics? Now we're talking about thinking like leadership. So while people are sitting there, they're lost in Ortugal, in the illusion of having leadership, we have the capacity and the ability to create leadership, but it's just, we don't want to create it. We just don't really want to do that work. We want to sit in the illusion and bask in what that means, but we don't want to do the work of really building nation. And we can go on and on. We talk about scholarship and the problems of scholarship, but there's not one institution in the U.S. that's fully funded by the Muslims, that's high-powered. And I'm not talking about what you consider high-powered. I'm talking about 360 high-powered, preparing actual scholarship and muftiship, to be able to tackle issues. People that are socially conscious. They have training in political science. They have training in sociology. They have training in counseling, and they have training in community organizing. They have training in the ability to give fatwa. They have training in the ability to collaborate. People that have the ability to analyze and work with different communities. People that have the ability to strategize. We don't have one well-funded organization like that. That's something that, we're attempting to do. That was one of the reasons why I was brought on to Islamic Learning Foundation in Chicago, to bring that type of vision, and that's something that we've been tackling for the past year or so. And that's something that I've been injecting my part in and my effort in. And I say that because some people have been asking, there was a critique that was made, like, where are you at? We see you on Facebook Live and this, that, but what community are you in? And I say that is not enough. That is not enough. I personally, say that, we're not in the communities that we need to be in 100%. You know what I'm saying? We have big lapses. We talk about, for instance, the issue of the black community, black crisis, so on and so forth. But how many of us are paying attention to the crisis of the black masjid? Some people say, well, how can you say black masjid, brother? Because I'm talking about the black community. You understand what I'm saying? They have their own masajid. How many of those masajid, we just look at the Ward of Deen community by itself. We're established, change local building codes so that those buildings can face Mecca. I know one is specific that I can think of in Cleveland, Ohio. They changed the zoning laws before anybody was thinking about that, in order for that masjid to face Mecca. And that masjid right now is full of just old people. There's a crisis of who will take on that facility and keep that legacy alive. It's right now in a gentrified area, meaning that building will go into the millions. And it was built by the African American community with the help of Muhammad Ali, rahmatullahi alayhi. Many people don't know the type of effort that Muhammad Ali went into building masajid, not only in the US, but globally, the types of contributions that were made. But that's just an example. For instance, if we talk right now, we're having all these conversations, but there's so many messages, not only in the Ward-al-Din community, outside of the Ward-al-Din community, that economically, they're in dire straits, and it's not even certain that they will exist. We talk about the Latino Dawah, but after all, how much money is actually going into the building of Latino leadership and letting that community develop itself with its own institutions so that it can deal with its own problems? That doesn't mean that no one else can come on board or be involved. But, we talk about caring. These are the situations. How many European American Muslims are coming into Islam, and they themselves also, they melt in. But deep down inside, I have personal conversations. This community has its own set of problems. It has its own issues. But how much is leadership being supported so that that community can develop? We have to start with developing within the context of tribes before we can ever come to a point of just saying that we're just one community and that's it. And if America, if the U.S. specifically, is still struggling with, are we the melting pot or are we the lettuce bowl? The Muslims are not exempt from that. The Muslims have their own issues in that regard. And so when we start talking about leadership, that's what's necessary. When we start talking about leadership, if we think about the concept of ummah or the concept of nation or the concept of the larger community of belief, well, it doesn't appear that we're really thinking about it, because when we look at the marriage situation, how many people I keep open conversations with people to get their feedback on what they think about relationships, so that I, as a community leader, can learn. And I try to look at my own experience and reflect back, because it's one thing to look at the books. It's one thing to know how to counsel from books. It's one thing to know how to understand what Islam says. It's another thing to understand where people are coming from or where people's situations are. But the amount of single Muslims that are having problems getting married, it's a crisis situation. And the amount of psychological issues that have come out of this. And so we talk about leadership, but we're not even paying attention to that. We're not paying attention to addressing that issue of bringing people together so that they have the ability to establish themselves as families, or even give them the training as communities, right? We want to offer the marriage counseling program, but then also there's the whole issue of where people were at. We want to give people the opportunity to be able to do these things, but also the community has to realize that there's a need for it. And there's a lot of things to be said about that. Preparing youth for the future. How many youth are really not prepared for the future? We have a crisis in the Muslim community right now across the board. Anybody that's dealing with the Muslim community and deals with different ethnic groups sees the change. There's a crisis that's taking place with our young boys. There's been such a push to deal with the situation of girls that a lot of our young boys don't know how to be men anymore. And that's across the board, across all ethnic groups. It's not just one ethnic group. It's across all ethnic groups. We're seeing that the boys are psychologically not prepared to be men. And we're seeing a massive imbalance. And because we have a society which has been paying attention to the plight of women, which I don't have a problem with that. We may disagree as a community as to where some of that stuff goes or some of the things that are emphasized. But there was a necessity to pay attention to the plight of women and young girls and so on and so forth. But now we've gone to such an extreme that the plight of boys and young men is ignored, is neglected. And so how do we expect to build community, build nation, if the plight of the family is not dealt with, if the plight of building family is not dealt with, if the plight of young people is not dealt with, male, female, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, and the same thing when it comes to counseling. There was a discussion being had about, decolonizing, and some people were saying, well, you're dealing with the issue of knowledge, and and how knowledge has been colonized and so on. Yeah, but how many think tanks do we have? If we want to talk about the issue, of being in leadership, how many think tanks do we have to deal with these issues? I can count the amount on three fingers, to be honest with you, to talk about if we really have think tanks as a Muslim community, or private institutions which give education in certain areas to deal with knowledge problems. And so when we talk about the investment in education, what is the real investment in education? Look, Muslims, they move into higher end neighborhoods, and I'm talking about, higher tax bracket neighborhoods, and they move there because they don't want to deal with the issue of having to build. And I understand you don't want to build, but you can't really talk about leadership if you're not willing to be in a position of building. Then you don't really have leadership 100%. You have to have that conversation of building, in order to really think about leadership 360. That doesn't mean leadership can't exist in other contexts and in other situations. But, like I've always learned in the past, and I still think that motto holds true. If you don't control your education, then you don't control your future. Okay, fine, you don't want to build the school system, but how many of you are on the school boards? How many Muslims have planned to go into a particular neighborhood, and they go into that neighborhood as families, and then they get on those school boards to ensure that education is a top quality education? That's what leadership looks like. Learning how to organize ourselves in those types of ways. How many of us, if we want to talk about our future and what leadership looks like, how many health campaigns do we have to talk about the quality of health in our community? I remember I did a khutbah on that, and one of the brothers came afterwards. He was from I did it in the bottom part of the Midwest, or the beginning part, as far as I'm concerned, which was Cleveland, Ohio. And one of the brothers said, I'm coming from the Virginia area, and it's refreshing to hear this as a khutbah. We need this more in our community. That's true. How many of us are talking about our health and the strength in that regard? And that changes a lot. It changes our mental health condition. And guess what? A lot of us are aging. And if we age in the wrong way, that means we're going to be, burdens to the system and burdens to our families. How many of us are talking about the aging population, and what are we going to do with all of these older Muslims that, basically have nowhere to go? There's been scattered conversations in the Muslim community with regard to the aging or the graying population, and what do we do with the needs of parents and so on and so forth, because some people, they can't take care of their parents. They don't have the capacity to. It's not because they don't want to, they don't have the capacity. So those become real issues at the end of the day. Now we have a crisis, goes back to the education front. Now we have a crisis, is a real crisis. And the crisis that we have now is that, what are we going to do with schooling? Are we going to let the system dictate to us, what is the procedure that is going to be followed with this COVID pandemic, with the schooling of our children? Some people are playing with the idea of wearing masks, and we're not even certain what it means medically or health-wise to wear a mask on hours on end, days on end. What does that mean to our health? And so this is part of the issue that we talk about. Like, people are left with making decisions on their own, and those decisions have real ramifications on us as a community, but we don't want to deal with these issues as a community to even have a community dialogue. And again, I'll leave off with this. The issue of social justice. We sit here and we debate with each other, and we even mock each other as Muslims. Social justice warriors. That's what liberals, that's the type of stuff, that's what we do when people start talking about social justice. But we have no real dialogue as a community with regard to social justice. So, the issue of political involvement and social change. As a community, what does that look like? What kind of dialogues are we having? And what kind of money should be directed towards that? And what kind of efforts do we think are effective? This is what communities look like that have leadership. If your community is not like that, our community is toxic. And you should know that it's toxic. You should label it as toxic. And you should ask yourself, what are you willing to do to change it? And I'm not talking about having conversations online and blasting the Muslims. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about strategic organizations of how we're going to revive our community and how we're going to save ourselves. Right? That becomes the reality at the end of the day. And so this is the task of the movement, that we have. We have to have these tough conversations, that go beyond just planning for individual organizations and individuals and small groups, And we have to have real leadership discussions about how we're going to move as a community. You know, our existence is precarious. All it takes is a little bit of a problem with the economy, and most of us are out of jobs. And everyone who thought they were flying high because they had a car note, a house note, and they're living in the best of suburbs. Once that goes, is poof. Your savings is gone. Poof. What are you going to do? Now you're back to third world conditions. So it shows that really, as a community, we're not understanding the game of survival and growth. And these are the types of discussions that we should have. We should have studies on all of these levels. On all of these levels, right? We should have studies on all of these levels. We don't have to always follow the plan in detail, but we should have some sense of where we want to be at in the world. And this is the conflict that some of us have with ourselves and with each other, that we know where we want to be at in the world. And we know that being there is not a solo individual effort. And we know that it's not just a small group effort. We know that getting there, you know what I'm saying, is a collaborative, cooperative effort of different groups coming together with solid leadership. Leadership that cares enough to say my ego can be set aside for the better common good. That's a reality. Yes, we don't even know what community is anymore. Not only us, society as a whole. We're talking about virtual community. If that virtual community is not set up for addressing real life situations, you know, it's helpful emotionally. I'm not knocking the online community, but it can't be a substitute for real life situations. And that's where we're at, because our real life situations are collapsed. We're falling back on these virtual relationships in order to sustain us. Right. Yes. And having a building is not only a community. Right. It's not the only definition that I have a building, I have an imam, I have a masjid. No, that's not a community. You're not at the community level itself. That's just, you have a building and you have someone that's there to be in charge. But what kind of leadership comes out of that? You know what I'm saying? What kind of leadership comes out of that community? And these are the types of discussions that we should be having. I keep saying this online. You know, flood the discussion waves with this type of stuff so we come into maturity. It works. You know, when you have these types of discussions, you begin to mobilize people. You begin to organize people. You know, they begin to think. They begin to express themselves. Right now, because of the way the situation is, we've never had a discussion this focused on the black community on a global level. We've never had this type of discussion overall, out in the open. Let's bring it all out in the open, all the problems that are there. And the same thing, we have to have discussions with government like this. You know, this is like community town hall discussions. We don't need to be in the same place in order to have community town hall discussions, but we need to be in one place in order to have local action, in order to be able to have action take place. And we can coordinate between different peoples and different regions, right? But we need to have these discussions, right? That's the reality at the end of the day. So, you know, people ask, I don't usually ask this, but I ask, share this video, make it viral in your circles, because we need to open up the door to these types of discussions, and we need this discussion now. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we are confronting situations that we've never confronted. All of the studies, and I said this about almost 3 months ago. I said it at the 2-month mark, and we're hitting the 3-month mark now. We're hitting the 4-month mark. I said this before. All of the studies that are coming from national, international institutions, that are coming from the banking system, that are coming from political analysis, all of them are saying that we're going to be headed for some very transformative moments. And we're not prepared for what may come. You know, there's studies that are coming out now that are talking about mass evictions. We're not prepared to house people. We need to be calling to the possibility of hijrah to land, so that we can deal with low-income Muslims that may be out of work. You know, we're seeing Walmart take a shift. Walmart is talking about automating its services. So what happens to all those Walmart workers? Companies are figuring out how to function without the same workload. You know, Starbucks closed 400 stores. So what does that mean for jobs? You know, there's some sectors of the economy that will not be coming back. Those sectors are gone. You know, so just because you see the stock market going up and, you know, down, and then now is going up, you can't judge the health of the economy predicated upon the stock market. The stock market is not going to measure where the real economy is at. You can't go by the fact that they said that, you know, unemployment rates went down a little bit. You know, the 2.5 million jobs that were added are restaurant jobs. You know how much a restaurant job pays? We're still in the debate in this country with regard to minimum wage. Target just announced that they're going to start talking about $15 an hour. But ask yourself, if $100,000 for a family of 4 is poverty line in New York City, right? What does that mean overall for the society? With gentrification, inflation has gone up in many areas that were affordable before. So we have a high housing crisis. We have a lot of crises that we're not ready to address. And I've mentioned this. I keep bringing this up so people don't say that Muslims are not responsible. And so they say imams are not responsible. Imams are not with it. No, imams are with it. Imams are talking. You know, and leadership is talking. Muslim community organizers are talking, but we're not being heard. And our agenda is not the priority agenda, which it should be the priority agenda, because this is what's being outlined is about your interests, oh Muslims. It's about society's interests. It's about our community's interests. Real discussions on where we should be moving forward, what we should be demanding from our local politicians, what we should be demanding from our religious organizations, what we should be demanding from how we spend our zakat and sadaqah money, what we should be demanding as far as how we're dealing with our time, what should be the focus of our conversation, right? And so, you know, I ask you, share the video, but more so I ask you, open up these dialogues, you know, on your platforms, question people. Make a post every day, one post every day. Make one post every day about community organization, about how to get involved. That's the most essential thing that we could do, right? Every day you flood, you know, you flood the platform that you have with a discussion on community building, on how to make it work, on how to organize, right? And that becomes something that can be done. You know, right now there's a major discussion on policing. We can community control police. You know, we know what kind of policing that we need in the community. We can deal with addressing crime issues. You know, people are not stupid. It's that people have selectively been marginalized out of dealing with their affairs. That's the bottom line. You know, in Puerto Rico, we have something that's called a Asamblea del Pueblo, which is like, basically, they're like townhouse meetings. Right. And so these townhouse meetings, people begin to organize from the grassroots, and you have people from every walk of life. They come together. And that's where you bigoted people, and I have to say it like that, you need to learn that the world is not just about me. It's not just about you. There's different types of people that are there. Also, you people that are egocentric, you need to learn that at times you have to follow. That's the reality. And you that are in leadership, you have to learn that you have to listen. But if we don't know how to organize ourselves, which is part of the problem, is a major part of the problem, that organization is only coming from government, the corporation. Religious organizations, they can organize to a certain extent, but really people, once you start getting out of those realms, people have a difficulty organizing and coming together. Once there's no money involved, then it becomes hard to weigh sway over people. That's why community organizations are awesome and are necessary. Volunteer organizations that are community-based, because these people know how to come together and they know how to do it without money. And that's a start. You know what I'm saying? And so that when people come together with money, they have the training on how to deal with these situations. And so then this is how you can begin to talk about, well, what is the budget for education? What is the budget for policing? You know, what is the budget for government spending? Or who said that a politician gets to get an increase in the raise? See, once that training is there, when people begin to learn how to make decisions, they learn how to come together, they learn how to dialogue, they learn how to plan, they learn how to strategize, they learn how to have vision, they learn how to budget, Once that education is there in the people, which is really what a democratic society looks like. John Dewey, one of the things that he had mentioned as a European American educationalist philosopher, one of the things that he said was that education is for government. And I mentioned this before, one of the things that Aristotle had talked about, and he wasn't the only one that said it, but we give props. He wrote it, and he wrote in his book, Politics, is that the highest level of philosophy or seeking wisdom is politics. And politics is not what people consider politics. Politics is with the affairs of the polity, with the affairs of the community. How do you allocate resources? What's the best decision making for this and that? Where do you construct this or that? How do you deal with the environment? Those are things that, when you get involved at that level, that's really where power is at. For those people who are power hungry, that's where power is at. What is the decision that's going to be made with the largest amount of good in mind, and how are we going to get there? That's what politics is really about. This other politics that we're seeing, we have a really deep issue. That's why we have a crisis right now in American democracy or U.S. democracy, because people are not involved. And they're letting career politicians make decisions for the communities, and it sucks. And this is why we're where we at. And it is the same thing that's going on in Puerto Rico as well, and in the territories overall of the U.S. Mismanagement, corruption, cronyism. There's the nepotism. There's a lot of things. No planning for the future, misorganization. There's a lot of things that are going on in that regard. And so what we're seeing now in this society, and I want to leave off of this, and I want to inject this in the dialogue as well. I'm 100% for defunding the police. But I'm going to tell you at the same time, I know that police officers, they're only making X amount of dollars, whatever their background. And so I know also that right now the people and the police are being pitted against each other, when the dialogue that should be taken should be right to the heart of the politicians that are career politicians behind the scenes. Those who are really making the decisions about where money goes and how money is spent, and creating the conditions that are pitting the groups against each other. That doesn't mean that there's not a real problem. There's a real problem. And defunding, what it means is community control over policing. That the community says, if this police practice is not operational, then we decide that we need a better practice. That, no, we don't need a nuclear sub to go to the local police department. No, we don't need $500,000 for cameras that don't work. You know what I'm saying? That's what defunding means. It means that you take control back over monies and decision making that was usurped from the community, and you make those democratically, governed organizations and institutions that have the ability to say, no, we don't want to put our police officers in harm's way. We want to train them the right way. And we have a problem that we haven't addressed, the shooting and the guns on the street. You know what I'm saying? And we respect people's gun rights, but also at the same time, we don't want to throw our police officers into those types of areas. You see what I'm saying? Now you think like a leader. Thinking like a leader is not only, F the police. That's not the leadership approach that's going to talk about transforming the community. That's maybe revolutionary in sentiment, but it's not in action. Revolutionary in action or transformative in action is when we start to talk about really the community as a whole, and how to really take a hold of institutions and really be involved so these institutions are effective. Because that's what the community means at the end of the day, that we have effective institutions which allow us to communicate with each other and be in communion with each other. And we don't have that right now. You know what I'm saying? And so this is right now, like Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quake said, it's a time to set a reset button on everything. On everything. Religious organizations are not exempt from having to analyze themselves and their thinking. Religious organizations are not divine. They're not infallible. Revelation is infallible. And that's a reality. Government is not infallible. Government is made by the people. So government itself has to be taken into account. The average person doesn't just have a right to freedom of speech without any accountability and responsibility. So everyone, all of us are accountable, and all of us, we have to be involved. And that's what I think that most of the time we don't know how to be involved. and we're overwhelmed with life so that we can't be involved. That's why we need economic changes. There was a proposal for the 4-hour work week, and so it's like that gives people time to be involved with their families, with their community. But also the 4-hour work week, if that means working 15 hours a day or 12 hours a day, that's not going to allow for community involvement. You know what I'm saying? So we need a lifestyle which allows us to be community involved, community based, family based. When you have families, when they're able to be there raising their children, that is crime prevention. Because now you have children in which families can be there, their emotional needs are met. They're not giving problems in the classroom because they're not emotionally anxious. When you have people that are involved with community and you have religious institutions that are effective and helping people meet their spiritual needs and their lives are meaningful, then yeah, you're not going to have people on the street just drinking for the hell of drinking and partying for the hell of partying, and doing self-destructive activities because they want to escape the hell of life. Part of the societal problems that we face is that there's a real existential crisis. There's a crisis of meaning in this society. And Mother Teresa had brought that up. It's not always necessary that there's a problem of material. There's also a problem of meaning. Although even when it comes to material, there's a problem of material, from the angle of we look at food. Our food is giving us disease, and so that's causing a national crisis with the medical industry. That a national state of emergency that Americans, U.S. citizens are overweight or are suffering from diabetes and so on and so forth. That's what all of these things need to come into discussion. Lifestyle 360. All of these things need to come into a discussion overall. A person that's really close to me was saying that it's sad that in European societies like Amsterdam, they can create a system to monitor women that are legally prostituting so that there's not a public health, issue when it comes to the issue of sexually transmitted diseases. But then when it comes to the issue of opening up the economy, when it comes to COVID, we have no system that we can bring in, whether it's in Puerto Rico or whether it's here. We have no system in place that we can come up with to control the whole issue of contamination and disease. But, in Amsterdam, they can come up with a system to make sure that their legal prostitution doesn't get out of hand so that STDs just become a problem in the society. That shows you where the leadership is at. There's no vision. There's no vision and really to deal with issues because the system as it is benefiting certain people. And alternative visions threaten the system as it is because some people are really living it up and really, doing well for themselves. But for the most part, many people are not doing well. The average American is at the point where in 2 checks, they can be homeless. Most are at, if 1 check doesn't come, they can be homeless. The average student is coming out of school with credit card debt. And I want to use the term this way. What the hell? We pay taxes, but we don't have free university education. So if we talk about nationalism, who really care? Who's really patriotic? In Europe, they have free education. We haven't talked about canceling the student debt. If you cancel the student debt, even in history, even in European societies, there was debt forgiveness. There was a forgiveness of debt. You forgive everybody their debt. If we can dump $1 trillion onto the system, we can forgive debt. If we forgave the debt, we will eliminate $1 trillion of debt and we won't have to worry about how to spend for the moment because we're starting from zero. But our politicians don't want to really address the issues. And I'm going to say this to you, and I'm going to say it to me, and I say it to me first, and then I'm going to say it to you. You're not going to like it. It's because of you. Because you're not involved. Because you don't care enough. These are not your priorities. You only care about yourself and your family. Some of you may take that to heart. You may get mad, like, who are you to say that? Yes, and I'm telling you that I'm saying it to myself first. We have to care enough to be involved if we want to see a change. Or if not, what we're leaving to our children is a disaster of a situation. If we don't know how to be involved, then we have to learn how to get involved. That means we have to get uncomfortable. that means that we have to say we don't have all of the solutions, right? And that's the reality at the end of the day, that we're going to have to learn from other people. And Muslims, you don't have the solutions. Don't interpret that you have revelation in the Quran and the Sunnah to say that you have the solutions, because you don't. You don't have the solutions. There's solutions in the Quran and the Sunnah, but you yourself don't have the solutions. If you had the solutions, you will be having the model community, the model society that will be something that we can all look to and say, well, look, this is how we can do it. But we Muslims are learning how to apply the Quran and the Sunnah to solve our situations. We're caught up, right? And so that means that we have to learn ourselves how to navigate Islam in this reality and how to navigate in this reality. So we're learning what the solutions are. And so these are, our messaging for the Islamic movement. You know what I'm saying? And these are things that we have to operate on, that we have to think about, you know what I'm saying? And we have to get real. It's critical. You know what I'm saying? It's critical. We're going into 2021. So we're 2 decades into the 21st century, and things are not looking well on a lot of levels. But the potential for greatness is there. The potential for doing 1,000 things is there. The solution for addressing 1,000 issues is there. But it's like you have to want it. We have to want it as a people. So the motivation has to be there. And stop talking about it's just me and my family. You know what I'm saying? That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is you thinking it's just about you and your family till you hit a wall and you realize that it's not about you and your family. When your family starts to get into issues, then you're looking for, well, who can help me? When you find yourself that your family's safety net is gone, you end up in a divorce or you end up in problems, and then all of a sudden you're turning around, hey, how can I deal with community? When you yourself find yourself in an economic situation or a psychological situation or a life crisis as an individual, then you're turning around, who can I turn to? Then all of a sudden it's like, where's the leadership? Why is the leadership not helping? Well, you didn't invest in that from the beginning. You had no commitment to the community before. So now you look to the community when you're in need and you're anxious and you're condemning and this and that. Or when you have a project and you want to lead that project and all of a sudden you need money, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, well, why don't you support me? Now you want to invest in the idea of community. That's selfish. From the reality of the situation is selfish. And that's why I'm saying, let us stop being selfish. Some of us, even internally within our own families, we're not extending out. And so it's not just about me and my family. What's happening is that psychologically, a lot of us, we mean well, we've been there, we've been involved, we burn out. And we have to admit, it's not working. And so that's why I say organize, learn how to organize, relearn how to organize, relearn how to organize, reorganize, because we have to keep doing this thing until we get it right. But without organization, it's not going to work. Assalamu alaikum.